According to the Declaration of Independence, a much celebrated document that has stood for the exceptional proposition that a certain we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their holy creator with certain unalienable rights. That was agreed upon in this very social contract, emerging from a state of nature, a paradigmatic shift in understanding that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Majority rules. And these 56 men, youngest of whom was the 26-year-old Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, the oldest of whom was the sagacious septuagenarian Dr. Benjamin Franklin, with a very firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, had mutually pledged to each other their very own lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, had yet acknowledged submitting for proof certain facts to a candid work, that all experience have shown that mankind are far more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. However, they had yet recognized that when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary under evolutionary pressure for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to their separation. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right. No, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new gods for their future security. Historically, some time had indeed passed between the Declaration of Independence and the signing of the Constitution, and consequently, only a handful of the original 56 signers, men of means and well-educated, not hardly commoners, had signed both documents. In fact, 9, some 16%, would die before the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, some 2 years after the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown. However, none would ever rescind nor recant that original pledge. Unquestionably, a wall of separation between church and state, notwithstanding, during what has historically been associated with an age of reason, not just religion, but quite singularly, Christianity and Christian thought had exerted great influence upon the founders and founding principles in this inchoate Democratic Republic. And half of the original 56 signers had divinity training. Some even to the point of becoming ordained ministers. But this was, of course, as was the case of most well-educated persons of means in that era. While one signer from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, who would become after a famous Virginia president, had expressed to the commissioned officers not evenly enlisted in the militia his American thought that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, wholly inadequate to the government of any other. A religious and moral nation. However, just before a world and nation were hit with the virus, met with silence and left unchecked, religious affiliation in America had experienced a very sharp decline of 12%. Highest declines in the black church, historically persons of great religious faith during that period. While Bible sales soared at the beginning of the pandemic, Bible reading had somehow experienced its sharpest declines. While as many as 24% of nuns, those professing no religious faith affiliation, had during historically times associated with fear, confusion, and despair bowed their heads, humbled their hearts, and turned to prayer. By August of 2020, 1/5 of the Christian churches that had already closed their doors to in-person worship have been forced to close their doors forever. The nuns, those who profess no religious affiliation, had continued to increase their numbers as the largest designated religious group, larger than Roman Catholics, climbing by 6%, approximately equal to the numbers who had departed Christianity, while the membership of the Satanic Temple, founded in Salem, Massachusetts, soared past 700,000, larger worldwide than the Rastafarians and the Universal Unitarians. Yet while most polls suggest that the influence of religion in America has declined, 7 in 10 Americans say that the COVID-19 pandemic and the government response had absolutely no impact at all upon their religious and spiritual lives. And from the founding days, in a Declaration of Independence, it had been acknowledged and accepted that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Majority rules. Indeed and invariably, all experience has shown that mankind are far more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. If you are not selling your product, nobody is running around the world to give you their money, to give you their faith, to give you their trust. Which is why salesmen say, always be closing. Always be closing. And the Bible said, go ye therefore, teach all nations. During a period of great civil unrest and upheaval, unparalleled until most recently in American history, when many supporting the status quo establishment had indeed, over 60 years ago, expressed a great deal of anxiety over a certain willingness to break laws in civil disobedience. Most certainly a legitimate concern, one now oft-quoted member of the clerical profession had in a now very famous letter written, "My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined, legal, and non-violent pressure." Recognizing a seeming paradoxical hypocrisy this young minister had yet observed, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision in 1954, outlawing segregation now and forever in public schools, it is rather strange and paradoxical to find us now consciously breaking laws. But as he had attempted to explain, history is the long and tragic story of the past, that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily, in the empirical absence of some countervailing evolutionary pressure. An object in motion, at least in science, remains in motion, while an object at rest maintains that reciprocal momentum. Generally, even in the schoolyard, the bully doesn't find Jesus and stop stealing your lunch. It's like a science. And at least in the mind of that clergyman, individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. They might be riding on their way to persecute persons and get knocked off their high horse. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals. Like Paul, this young minister had then posited that he must constantly respond to a Macedonian call. Could not sit idly by in Atlanta when he knew that there was injustice then in Birmingham. Yet even one converted and apostolic former persecutor of Christians had in an intellectual honesty to admit in confession a good that he would, but still did not. And perhaps only in an aspiration, this great Negro preacher had opined, "I am sure, certain and confident, that if I had lived in Germany during that terrible time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal at the time." A Monday morning quarterback never lost a game. He had most inspiringly expressed a thought, for example, if I had lived in a communist country today, where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws, and probably most adherents in religious faith and conviction, going one day to be with the Savior in heaven, having confessed their sins and been saved, might concur with this sentiment to say, Amen. Me too. Can I get a witness? However, the proof is in the pudding. And the best predictor of future performance can most often be found in the indelibly recorded record of the past. And like no cases have been brought with respect to the closing of public schools where the children attend, described in a landmark decision handed down by the nation's highest court as perhaps the most important function of state and local government. Very few, if any, religious leaders or organizations had brought a challenge to a courtroom. The constitutionally provided forum to settle cases and controversies, even though the Virginia governor, the nation's only position serving as a state governor, had most reluctantly conceded that he could not legally limit in-person worship ceremonies, noting that the recent Supreme Court decision, brought only by a few, against the state of New York had prevented him from doing that. Yielding to a pressure that was brought, not voluntarily walking away from doing what he had done. And hence it is hardly surprising to the extent that to secure these even religious rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, majority rules on March 31st with no evolutionary pressure. The federal district court had dismissed an action brought under the provisions protecting the entrances to places of worship under the PACE Act 18 U.S.C. Section 248, subparagraph A, subparagraph 2, under an assertion by the government of a most sovereign immunity, by declaration not dead, but alive and well in Virginia. In the opinion of the court, in the absence of an unequivocal waiver, made unmistakably clear that the government has waived its immunity from legal liability. Any claims brought against the government are barred by this affirmative defense or plea in bar. Under the First Amendment, however, expressly stated, Congress, the very legislative power of the federal government, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And this protection and guarantee of religious liberty is extended to the several states under the 14th Amendment. Under the PACE Act, expressly and categorically, whoever, without any noted exception, by force or threat of force or by physical obstruction intentionally injures, intimidates, or interferes with, or attempts to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person, without exception, lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise that First Amendment right of religious freedom at a place of religious worship shall be subject to the penalties provided. However, in the opinion of the federal court, in the absence of any great evolutionary pressure, on March 31st, if sovereign immunity has not been waived, a claim is subject to dismissal under Rule 12b-1 for lack of subject matter jurisdiction, and the court cannot discern any language in the opinion of the court, cannot discern any language in the PACE Act resembling a clear waiver of sovereign immunity. Moreover, in the opinion of the court, in the absence of any great evolutionary pressure, the statute does not state it is stripping away any immunity at all. Accordingly, in the opinion of the federal court, as of March 31st, sovereign immunity bars any FACE Act claim brought against the government. And the church, once again, got mighty silent. I didn't hear nobody pray. At least according to one all-quoted member of the clerical profession, the sons of Aaron historically consecrated only to be burners of incense, not all prophets. There are just laws, and there are unjust laws. And he would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. He had said that he had come to Birmingham because injustice was there. Who is it that is supposed to articulate the longings and aspirations of the people more than the preacher? He had asked in a rhetorical inquiry. He, in turn, had answered himself. Somehow the preacher must have a kind of fire shut up in his bones. And whenever injustice is around, he, not somebody else, must tell it. Somehow the preacher must be an Amos and saith, when God speaks, who can but prophesy? At least he had urged and exhorted his fellow ministers of the gospel in what would be his last public address. To his fellow ministers of the gospel, a marvelous picture, always beautiful to see. He exhorted with Amos, let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. And under federal precedent, however, mere acquiescence or silence or failure of an officer to perform a duty does not make one a participant in a conspiracy unless he acts or fails to act with knowledge of the purpose of the conspiracy and the view of protecting and aiding it. Under federal precedent, prior to questioning any suspect has a right to remain silent. Under federal precedent, a defendant is presumed to continue his involvement in a conspiracy unless he makes a substantial affirmative showing of withdrawal, abandonment, or defeat of a conspiratorial purpose, and mere cessation of activity in furtherance of the conspiracy is not sufficient to show withdrawal. And in the Commonwealth, if a defendant is present, he has a duty to speak. Then he must. As the court had observed in Hill v. Woodward in 1884, by her conduct, as disclosed by the record, the appellant is stopped from questioning the verity of the record. Her evident knowledge of the pendency of this suit and its object, her seeming acquiescence, and her delay and refusal to speak, though not served with notice in the regular way, makes it proper for her to remain silent now that others have acquired rights while she was standing by in silence, if not in actual acquiescence. It was not only competent for her to speak in time and be made a party if she had not been, but it was her duty. And so, as even in a marriage, queer as it may be, In life, we have an opportunity to speak now or forever hold your breeze. You may now kiss the ground. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.